This sitting is resumed.
Order number 3.
Mr. President, I would like to move that we postpone further consideration of the Appropriations Bill 2019 in order to deal with the resolution in accordance with Section 3. Order number 4. Yes.
The question is that further consideration of the Appropriation Bill 2019 be postponed in order to deal with Order 4 on today's order paper. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Order number 4, sir. In the name of the Honorable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution in accordance with Section 3 of the British American Insurance Company, Barbados Limited, Preservation of Investments Act 2016, Act 2016-5, to allow the government to issue to Surgical Life Incorporated promissory notes in the amount of 8.5 million Barbados dollars on the terms and conditions set out in the schedule to facilitate the preservation of the pension plans of 72 employees of British American Insurance Company, Barbados Limited.
Mr. President, this resolution that we are dealing with here today is one with regard to the British American company Barbados Limited, formerly known as BACO, for the preservation of investments under the Amendment Bill 2018. this is, the matter for consideration is for to issue promissory notes in the amount of 8.5 million in order to assist Sagicor Life, Inc. with the preservation of the pension plans of 72 employees of the British American Insurance Company Limited. This money and the terms and conditions under which this money will be used is certainly to ensure that the promise that was made to these individuals is kept, and that the promissory notes will then be able to assist in their receiving these payments, and so that they would not be disadvantaged. Under some of the restructuring, or I should say the absorption of British American Insurance Company's pension arrangements by Sagicor, it's in order to provide support to them, because as you know, they would have assumed the British American pension plan that was formerly under BACO. Now, there's a protective clause in here that will further safeguard the interests of the policyholders, not safeguard the principal amounts, the yields, and the maturities of the government bonds to be issued in accordance with the sale and purchase agreement. So, all the parties involved in the transfer of these assets and liabilities are in support of this methodology in order to meet this requirement. So we're hoping that this will at least assist these 72 individuals, where they will now no longer be under some of the difficulties that they would have been experiencing, unable to access these pensions. So without saying much more on it, I mean, it's pretty straightforward and pretty self-explanatory. I now would, at this point, Mr. President, like to move that this resolution do now pass.
Senator Franklin.
They're being, sorry? Yeah, thank you. Sir, I said that I'm completely in favor of this resolution. And I'm speaking only to highlight the disparate treatment between people in the private sector who can benefit from a resolution like this and civil servants. And I said, if you recall, during the estimates debate, I spoke to the government compensating young people who have been retrenched with their pension money, because gratuity is, in fact, a portion of your pension. The way you calculate gratuity is that you gratuity in the public service, that is, the government takes a quarter of your pensionable emoluments and the annual emoluments, that is, and multiply it by 12 and a half. As I said, the theory back, the actual advice back in 1947 was that civil servants used to live 12 years after retirement. And as a result, they give you this lump sum payment as a gratuity. So gratuity is, in effect, part of your pension. You get the gratuity, and then you get a reduced pension, which will be then the 3/4 of the pension that you would have been entitled to, and they give it to you in monthly increments. So these people here are benefiting from the government's generosity, and rightly so, because they were not at fault. But they are abolishing pensions for public officers. And this is the start with this government, you know. In 1969, the government got rid of the pension for the casual employees. Then in 1975, and public officers who started to work after the 1st of September 1975 are now only entitled to one pension, because, mind you, technically you're entitled to both, but the pension that you get from the government is reduced by the amount you get from national insurance. So in effect, you get the higher of the two pensions. Mind you, you are contributing to national insurance pension, that is yours. But what people don't understand is that technically you have been contributing to your own pension from the public service. And I give the example where two people doing the same job in the public service, one is pensionable and the other is not. The guy who is pensionable, he waits until he reaches retirement age and he gets his gratuity and pension. The guy who is not pensionable, he gets an additional 20% of his salary. So the job is worth 20% more. But people seem not to understand that and think that government is doing public workers a favor when they do not pay the gratuity, or when they say, well, oh, we're not giving you. Government should have set aside that 20%. They give it to the contract officers who work in the same post. They give them 20% more. So your job in the public service, if you're a clerical officer or a permanent secretary, your job is actually worth 20% more than they're paying you. That 20% is supposed to go towards your pension. But, sir, we heard in the budget that the Prime Minister, and I think she's speaking from bad advice. You know, you want to balance the budget, but you cannot balance the budget by taking advantage of public workers. You know, we have to find a way around it. I remember I did a consultancy for the Caribbean Congress of Labour some years ago, and they were dealing with pensions in some of the smaller islands. And one of the recommendations was that government fund the pension scheme rather than wait to pay pensions out of current revenue. You put a set of money in the pension plan, and then the government have to worry about finding the pension money, because it would have been set aside, it would have been allocated during the normal scheme of things. But rather than find innovative ways of dealing with pensions for public officers, they start abolishing. So they got rid of the pension for public officers, while at the same time, the government retained two pensions for judges, the Governor General, and parliamentarians. Yes. And while I'm at it, public service pensions used to be payable from age 55. You had an option to retire at 55 or compulsory at 60. And over the years, the government increased the retirement age because of the strain of the revenue. And people were saying, well, if we don't do something about this, we can go broke because we've got too many young pensioners, because people are living longer. But would you believe that in 1989, the government probably thought that parliamentarians die early. So, having taken up the retirement age for public officers at that time to 65, government shifted theirs down the line. So from 55 now, they're brought it down to 60. So in fact now, public officers are entitled to pensions at 67, while MPs are entitled to their pension 17 years earlier. That is not fair. They get their pensions at 50. At 50, most people are young and strong and vibrant. And what is also hurtful is that the pension paid to the MP is entitled to his pension after 8 years service. And he's entitled to half the salary that he was getting. A civil servant, after 10 years, is entitled to 1/5. MP, after 12 years, he is entitled to 2/3 of his pension. After 33 and 30 years, the civil servant is entitled to the same pension, 2/3. So we are seeing situations where government is taking care of these people. Now, I was saying that government should take care of the vulnerable, and these are vulnerable people. So I have no difficulty with that. But government needs to change its policies in respect of public officers. And I do not like the idea of a person commit themselves to working in the public service all their lives, and most public officers work hard. They got a few slackers. But most public officers work hard, and then after working, and you did not manage to put aside some money in a private pensions plan for yourself, you live a life of genteel poverty. Because you don't want to walk with the place begging, so you start home and you eat Eclipse biscuits and corn and saltfish mashup together. It's called salt biscuits. That's what they eat 2 weeks after they get the pension because they can't afford anything else. well, probably don't even put saltfish in seasoning. But, sir, we are taking care of these. So all I want the government to do is to review their pension arrangements with people who understand the pension arrangements. I spoke also about persons, a misinterpretation of the pension Act, which has damaged a lot of persons in this country. Under the Pensions Act, Cap 25, you are entitled to a pension after 10 years service. But if for some reason the government abolished your post, in the private sector you call it making the post redundant. So don't let me get tight with terms. They call it abolishing the post in the public sector. If your post is abolished, from 1947 down to sometime in the 1990s, the Campbell case, the people who had 10 years service were entitled to their pension until such time as government found another job for them. And then when the government, and then if you do not accept the job that government finds for you, your pension ceases until you reach retirement age. Now, with that misinterpretation in the Campbell case, people have to wait until they reach 60. So if, like the guy I mentioned in the estimate, he's 28. He will have to wait until 60 to get his pension. All I'm saying, sir, is government needs to review the pension arrangements, not only for people in the private sector who, and I'm saying through no fault of theirs, have lost theirs. Look out for the people who work for the government, whose only job is working for the government. I am grateful, sir, that you indulge me in speaking on the public service pension, even though this thing has nothing to do with it. But I thought that I would mention it in this context. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Mr. President, this resolution, as we are well aware, I won't go into any long, lengthy detail on it. I'm glad I have support from over on the other side of the chamber. It's always welcome when people support things that will benefit Barbadians. 72 Barbadians, at whose no fault was it of theirs that they were in this situation. It was not their fault that there was mismanagement of the entities known as British American Insurance Company, CLICO, and all the other companies that came under the umbrella group that of CL Financial here in Barbados. But government is always cognizant that we would not want people to be disadvantaged when these things happen in companies who they put their trust in. And I can assure you that they would put their trust in this company for what they would have seen as their retirement years, where they would then have benefited from their pensions. But as we have had to do once again, come along and clean up someone else's mess, Mr. President, we are doing that once again here and ensuring that these 72 Barbadians do not suffer. Not a lot of long talk, a lot of speeches, a lot of what happened in 1927 and what happened in 1942 and what happened in what year was that? Some people, I think, Mr. President, the Senate, were not born in 1929 or whenever it was that we were just speaking about on the other side. So no talk here. What we are doing is what we have continued to do. Promise made, promise kept. And with that, I would like to move this resolution now be passed.
Question is that this resolution do not pass. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The resolution has been passed.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honourable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the resumption of the second reading of the Appropriation Bill 2019.
I recognize for this Senator Crystal Drix.
Good morning, Mr. Deputy President. As we resume the debate on the appropriation bill, I just want to say that my contribution today is based on a lot of things that I heard during the budgetary proposals last week given by the Honourable Prime Minister. And my contribution is based on things that ran through my mind and things that sat on my heart. And in doing so, I want to start my contribution with a translation of Ecclesiastes 9:11, chapter 9:11, verse 11. For those of you who are not very well acquainted with Bible scriptures. Sir, and that translates to a saying that goes, the race is not for the swift, nor is it for the strong, Mr. Deputy President, but it is unto them that endure to the end. And sir, that means, Mr. Deputy President, that those who endure outperform those that are swift and those that are strong. But sir, when I look at the definition of to endure or endurance, it paints a very somber picture. The definition of endurance is to suffer patiently. Suffer patiently, Mr. Deputy President. And sir, I say that on the backdrop of last week, we were now told that we're looking at a 7-year recovery timeline. So between now and 2025, sir, we have to endure some would say. But sir, in that presentation, something else sparked me that the Honourable Prime Minister stated. And it wasn't a policy measure. And it was a very simple statement and almost a request. And she said, we have to stop being a small nation with even having smaller conversations. We have to stop being a small nation having smaller conversations. And that, Mr. Deputy President, is how I would like to make my contribution. I would like to premise my contribution on that statement. Sir, what I'm going to ask is that we not only endure, but we elevate the conversation in Barbados to one where we also have personal and collective responsibility to empower ourselves. So let us not just endure, but let us also empower ourselves. Sir, to empower means to make stronger, to make more confident, and especially in controlling your own life and establishing and claiming your rights. So regardless of the circumstance, we have to find a way to bring pride back to ourselves and to truly be craftsmen, and I will be gender equal here, and craftswomen of our faith. And today, sir, as I said, I want to share things that are also resting on my heart. And I want to say to all young Barbadians and young adults in Barbados that who in 7 years will not even reach the age of 40, let's stretch that to 50. Sir, it will be that category of persons which this extended fund facility, this IMF program that we found ourselves in, we will be the ones to be hardest hit in the prime of our working years. Sir, it is persons like myself that will have to endure this extended fund facility. And unlike our parents who would have held jobs for 25 years, 30 years, and then go on to retire, we do not have that luxury of that type of stability that occurred in the 1990s or that occurred in the 2000s, the early 2000s. The world that we have to work and live in is much more volatile. And sir, that volatility has become normal. And in that volatility, we have to learn to adapt and to endure. That endurance, sir, will not come from government policy, because policy will help to facilitate how we empower ourselves. Mr. Deputy President, we have to work in a space where the young generation in 2040 come up to us and say, thank you. Thank you for the sacrifice that you made during this time. Much like how when we meet any of those public servants who were sent home in 1991, because their sacrifice meant that Barbados could recover in a way that we had the stability that we had during the 1990s. So with that, we have a financial plan that the government has brought to us for the year 2019-2020 in the format of the estimates, as we all know, and the package of measures outlined in the budget. And sir, I have to say, it has been a winding road in the last 10 months with a number of policy measures being either retracted or changed. So we had the change in the income tax with the upper tax band, those working over $75,000. That tax band was increased to 40% or introduced to 40%. And now we find ourselves with an entire new structure as it relates to income tax. Corporation tax had even a larger movement We went from 25% to 30%. Now we have a corporate tax rate between 1 and 5.5%. Sir, we now have to relook the garbage and sewage levy for commercial entities, given the increase in the water rates that were announced. Sir, the debt restructuring. It was said all stakeholders were supposed to carry the burden, but because of the plight of pensioners, that also was relooked. And sir, then you have things like the value-added tax for online transactions, having the movement of its introduction as well. So sir, the argument could be made on one side that there have been a lot of twists and turns in this young administration and as it relates to policy. But that is one side of the argument. Some would say that the government is responsive and is adaptive to change. But sir, I think one fair thing that can be said as it relates to some of the policy measures is that it has created some level of uncertainty. Mr. Deputy President, we are now operating, as I said, under an IMF extended fund facility. And to give that context in terms of the importance or the magnitude that it has on a country like Barbados, I want to say that we are the only small island developing state at the moment under an extended fund facility. Sir, countries such as Gabon and Angola are under extended fund facilities. Even more so, we're not just in an extended fund facility, we're in a 4-year extended fund facility. And only 2 other countries have that type of program in place, and those are Bosnia and Tunisia. With that extended fund facility, we have to achieve a primary surplus of 6%. To put that into context, and I've said this already in one of my presentations, it means that government coming into office had to rake in from the economy almost $1 billion. And that was through reducing expenditures, through layoffs and other measures, and increasing tax revenues. And sir, on that backdrop, this is why most persons would say that the Barbados Economic and Recovery Transformation Plan is one of austerity. Because when you look at the plan, it did have growth elements, but it seemed to be only within the realms of business climate reforms and foreign direct investment. And sir, there was good cause for persons asking for an economic growth plan, because when you look at the sectoral performance of the last year in the central bank report, you would be concerned. Sir, I'll share this with you so you can have context. The entire economy contracted by 0.6% last year. Tourism fell by another 0.6%. And to put that in very plain terms, we made $7 million less in 2018 than we did in 2017. Manufacturing fell by $3 million. Sugar increased by $700,000, not $700 million, 700,000. The category of other agriculture increased by $2 million, not a bad performance. But sir, it is in non-traded sectors, such as transport, electricity, construction, and retail. They fell by $57 million. So that type of picture, along with government trying to reach a primary surplus of 6%, is cause for concern, because it looks as though you have no way of driving growth through the sectoral avenues when you look at the statistics. Sir, moving now to the budgetary measures that were introduced last week. As I said, the first thing that caught my eye was the 7-year recovery. We're now looking at 7 years. The first rhetoric that we heard coming from the government was a 2 to 3 year recovery. Now we're saying it's 7 years. And I'm actually happy that the government has come out and said it's going to be about 7 years of recovery, because I think it's more realistic and I think it's more practical. And I think it sends a message to Barbadians that we are in this for the long haul. Sir, I'm also happy because of a personal position that I have when it comes to economic policy. Sir, 2025 now removes or appears to remove the elements of what I call political mischief from economic policy. Because if you line up the timelines for the recovery and you say it's 2 to 3 years, there's some people that would say, oh, they're just waiting for the electoral cycle so they can come back and say, we've done all these things within the first, well, I don't want to say first term, within this term of serving. So, sir, I'm happy about that, because what that means is you now remove, or appear to remove, as I said, this hand sometimes that politics has in economic decision making. And sometimes it's to our own detriment when we do that. And we're not honest with people about the things and the hardships that come along with some policies. Sir, the 2025 target, though, will also be met with a number of external factors that could affect our recovery. Geopolitical factors, economic factors, environmental factors, the list goes on and on. As I stand on my feet, I believe at some point the UK will be deciding and voting on the Brexit deal, and we have to still figure out what happens after that motion is passed in the UK. It has failed, Mr. Deputy President, I am hearing. So all of these things have implications for us. The US trade tensions, and God forbid, sir, if we're hit by a major storm or hurricane. And I believe the last time I checked, we are actually due for a major hurricane. You may rebuke it, but the statistics say that we are actually due for a major hurricane here in Barbados. So all of these factors are a part and parcel of what could affect our recovery. And sir, I want to also emphasize our recovery, because whether you support the current administration or not, your fate is tied to how we perform as a country. Sir, the Barbados Labour Party is not the one who has to attain a primary surplus of 6%. It is the nation of Barbados. It is the nation of Barbados. And I want to also say that at some point, we have to stop playing politics and get on with the business of creating economic and business opportunities for all Barbadians. Sir, the divisive nature of politics sometimes can be extremely destructive. And I said I will speak on things that are close to my heart this morning. Because when I look around at Caribbean politics and Caribbean development, there's a personal ethos that I have. And it is in the case that elections sometimes are a necessary evil. And that is not to take away anything from democracy. But in terms of economic longevity and policy making, sometimes we make short-run decisions to satisfy a short-run desire. And that is not to say that we haven't made progress. But what about all of those policies that we threw out the window because it came from a previous administration? What if we had the foundation of those policies along with those changes that were needed to be made to propel us forward. Sir, sometimes running between the wicket for singles wins a game just as much as 4 and 6-6. So there's nothing wrong. There is nothing wrong, Mr. Deputy President. There's nothing wrong with taking your time. There's nothing wrong with being shy on the ball. There is nothing wrong with it. But sir, I want to get back to the measures before I get too sidetracked and listen to the asides. Sir, as it relates to the tax refunds and changes to the income tax, we now see that the government is saying that they are going to give back the refunds owed to persons in terms of personal income tax, VAT, and corporation tax refunds. But sir, I just want Barbadians to know that that is also a program condition. And I'm not saying that the government wasn't genuine in giving back the refunds. What I'm saying is it is an IMF program condition. And sir, in saying that, there are also a lot of things, and Senator Maynard, I'm sorry he's not here, drew to my attention the last time we were in the chamber, is that Barbadians can actually, they're allowed, under Section 55A of the value-added tax, they're allowed a rebate on building materials for houses valued under $400,000. So it is not always the case that the government has to give you back something, but you are entitled to it. But it's if you have the information to do so. Sir, the government has now made persons earning between $18,000 and $1, I'll try to be correct with my numbers, to $25,000 eligible for the reverse tax credit of $1,300. And that is persons, sir, working for approximately $2,000 a month. Sir, if you work between $25,000 and $1 and $35,000, you are now eligible for a new measure called a compensatory income credit, which is up to $1,250. And that is persons working for approximately $2,900, up to $2,900 a month. So persons working up to $2,000 and $2,900 a month, sir, are now eligible for these measures. Sir, now we have also a personal allowance. After the personal allowance is taken out for the $25,000, we have persons in the first tax band of $50,000 paying 12.5%, and those in the second tax band paying a rate of 33.5% up until January 1st, 2020, and then it will be reduced to 28.5%. And this is just out of curiosity because I'm a curious person. What is the rationale for changing it after January 1st, 2020? Sir, in the estimates, it says that government is trying to accumulate $536 million from income tax. So I'm just curious as to why on January 1st, 2020, that upper income band will be further reduced. It's just a query. But sir, what was also said is that through these income tax measures, it is to place money back into the hands of Barbadians, which is rightly so, because it increases the amount of disposable income that they have. And it is to spur spending, and I believe it was Senator Haynes that noted it is economic stimulus. It is. But there's one caution that I haven't heard being ventilated with this type of measure, and that has to do with the structure of small open economies. When you increase disposable income in a small island state like Barbados, sir, persons usually spend money on consumable goods. Sir, the danger with it is that we have a high propensity to import. Every dollar that is spent in Barbados, 80 cents of it, these are the last statistics that I have, 80 cents of it, 80 cents on the dollar is actually spent on imports. So when you increase the disposable incomes of Barbadians, what happens is you drive up the demand for foreign exchange because 80% of it goes to imports. So that is just one caution that I would like to highlight in terms of increasing the disposable income of persons here in Barbados. And I'm not against it. It's not a measure that I'm against. I'm just looking at the economics of it in a small island context. That type of measure, sir, would work well in a country like China, for instance. Because of the large industrial base that they have, if you consume more, it goes back into local production. For us, what it does is it goes into imports. So, sir, along with all the other things, the income tax will be also affected by the increase, as we know, as we've heard rightly so, in bus fares, the increase in land tax, the increase in certain payments for withholding tax, and obviously the much debated and still very confusing online VAT measure. So, sir, what we have to do, given that backdrop of having a high propensity to import, I think we also have to start having a discussion on how do persons in Barbados spend money? How do we spend money, Mr. Deputy President? Because if you look around, we have somewhat become a nation of consumers. We get money, we consume products. And what would be interesting to find out is how do persons in Barbados actually view money? Do they view it as just a source of spending, or do they see it as a source of investment? Sir, and I want to say this, and this is not to single out a particular ethnicity, but particularly to Black Barbadians, that we, and I include myself because that is what I am, we as a grouping of individuals have to really start getting serious. If we are to endure and if we are to empower ourselves, start looking at group economics. And group economics means that if I have $5, I'm limited by that $5. If I can trust my neighbor, or let's say 20 of them, and they each have $5, I now have access to $100. I'm no longer limited to my individual $5, and that is what group economics is about, sir. I'm going to get to the crowdfunding, Senator Holder. But, sir, and I look around my community, and I say my community because, as I said, I am a Black Barbadian, and I realize it is a way in which to utilize money that we have not used. We have not really delved into it. We have our meet interns and so on, but a lot of meet interns are used for good purposes. I'm not to say that, but a lot of people use it, for instance, to go away and to spend more. I have never once heard of a meet intern that is actually aimed at creating a business. I may be young, so I don't know, Mr. Deputy President. You may be able to guide me on that. But I've never heard of a meet intern that is used to build investment for a business in Barbados. So these are the types of conversations that I want us to start having, because what we also have to do in building growth as a people, we have to start talking about generational wealth, and these are the things that we have to start talking about in Barbados. And we have to look outside of the country, the confines of the small island that we live in, and look outside for opportunities. Sir, I also want to say, part of it may be on the lending institutions that we have as well, because they have created an appetite only for allowing credit for liabilities. They will give you a credit card, Mr. Deputy President. They will give you a car loan. They will give you a Christmas loan. They will give you credit to go and spend money, to travel. If you need to buy a costume, come in. We have low rates for crop over. But sir, if I walk in to a bank and I said I need $60,000 to start a business, no, I probably would get it for a car loan. Bring the pay slip, job letter. You get it. But if I say $60,000 to start a business, I have to bring my mother, probably dig up my grandmother who's resting in peace, and everybody in the yard for the collateral. The chances of me getting that loan is slim to none. But I would get it for a liability, but I wouldn't get it for an asset that increases my wealth. So, sir, as I said, we have to not only endure the test, but we have to empower ourselves. And I think maybe not in part because of our own ability, but we failed one or two generations as it relates to financial literacy. But sir, we are in an age now of free information, and I urge all Barbadians to hold themselves accountable now for their own financial situation. Because, as I said, many of us, as it has been touted, we're good at saving $9 billion in savings in financial institutions. But I ask the question, how many of us are good at investing? How many of us understand something as simple as simple interest rate and compounded interest rate? How many of us know about asset management, liquidity, stock and flows? What are we teaching our children? I understand that digitization may be able to propel us forward. But if you don't understand money and the power of money, how do you use money to make more money? We may find ourselves in the same trap, going around and around. And so I talk about financial literacy in terms of, and as I said, I think about things very differently. I look at financial literacy, Mr. Deputy President, as how the late Honourable Prime Minister Errol Barrow would have thought about free education. How do you liberate a mass of people? How do you liberate a mass? How do you bring a section of your society, a large section of your society, into a new social status? And I think financial literacy has a key part to play in that upliftment and liberation going into the 21st century for Barbadians. But sir, now I go back to the measures because I'm also a little bit cautious of the increase in VAT on the room rate levies on our tourism product and moving some of our export services to being value-added tax exempt. Because, sir, both of these measures increase the cost of our export products, which, in my view, given the backdrop of how we performed last year, may be a little counterintuitive, as exports are clearly a key driver in a small island state to growth. Sir, the VAT and the room rate levy means that we become more expensive as a tourism destination, and the VAT exemption means persons who are involved in certain services or goods and services that they export now have to absorb the VAT. They can no longer apply for a VAT refund. So, sir, I have some caution behind those measures. Sir, we also saw an increase in water rates, which answered my question when I looked through the estimates, and I tried to find, in all desperation, the Barbados Water Authority, and I was told it just isn't there, and I said, but how? We allocate about $50 million every year to the Barbados Water Authority, but the new rates that commercial entities are paying for between 40 cubic meters and 12,000 cubic meters at the rate of $7.78 per cubic meter is supposed to bring in 2.1, I believe, million dollars a month, which is around $24.2 million a year. So if we're allocating 15 million, and the Barbados Water Authority now with the new rate can more than pay for some of its operations through this new measure, then no need for allocation. But sir, what that also does is it drives up the costs of businesses who use water, who heavily use water. Sir, even now that I think about it, I believe there was an article already about the farmers, those in the agricultural sector, being a bit wary about the impact that this measure will have. Sir, and I think we also now have to start having a conversation about the reuse of gray water. We have to start having a conversation about how do we effectively utilize rainwater harvesting, and not just for agricultural purposes, but also for residential use. I've gone to islands and I've used rainwater for bathing, drinking, and that is what is used. I mean, what it would mean is that you have to have stricter enforcement and regulation so that you go around and you check to make sure that the water people are utilizing is of a certain standard. But we have to start looking at different ways in utilizing water and possibly getting people off of the system and having their own independent supply. Sir, in discussing the empowerment of persons as we endure, I want to talk about the crowdfunding platform that was mentioned in the budget. And I was actually a little excited in my seat when I heard it. And that is in all honesty. Because too many times in Barbados that I've seen, you have persons with the capital, they have the cash, but they don't have the marketplace to meet that person with the good idea who is looking for that investor. And sir, if we can get a platform that brings these two groups together, that is something that I will definitely support. But on top of that, I believe platforms such as those can also start to break away from what is almost still looked at as the plantocracy model that we have in Barbados, where we have a large majority of persons having very little and a small majority having a lot. And sir, if we want to achieve real development, a greater number of persons in Barbados have to attain wealth. And this is not an indication that we're taking away something from someone. It is that you're increasing the amount of asset base that other persons in society have. So another measure that I want to talk about is the green energy bonds. It didn't go into too many details, but it's one that I look forward to. Because in places like Canada, and I hope that the portfolio is expanded when it does, because it was said that even though you may not be utilizing renewable energy in your own space, these bonds will allow you a credit if you invest in them for your electricity supply. That is what I understood from it. But sir, I hope that we get to a place when those types of bonds are used for registered retirement saving plans and tax-free saving accounts in Barbados, where you now have persons not only getting a credit for their energy use, but they're earning interest on the investment. And sir, let me say here that I noticed when the leader of government business introduced the bill, he said he wants to get his rhetoric right when he said we want to be carbon neutral. I don't know if that has anything to do with the whispers that I've been hearing about oil exploration off of our coastlines. But what I want to say about that is that the experts have said that at the latest, in the 2020s, renewable energy will have grid parity with fossil fuel generated electricity. So it means when you have grid parity is that both types of energy production will have the same costs. So I beg on my feet this morning that we do not tie ourselves to outdated technology. And we also not become hypocrites, Mr. Deputy President, because to invest in oil exploration or fossil fuel use is to become hypocritical as a small island state. Because when you see the occurrences of what happened in the hurricane season in 2017, the devastation that was caused by Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma in the Caribbean, you're now investing in something that fuels that type of natural disaster. Mr. President, I now turn to the issue of bus fares. I was a bit wary if I should speak on it, but I will. And sir, I want to bring context to it. Sir, bus fares in St. Lucia range from US 60 cents to US $2. It's also the same in St. Vincent. In St. Kitts, it's US $1. And now here in Barbados, it will be a flat rate of US $1.75. Sir, and the Transport Board has genuinely, if you want to say, it has become almost a hemorrhage of government funds. Sir, the revised estimates, the subsidy is now, for 2018 and 2019, the revised estimates was at $23 million in subsidies for the Transport Board. And sir, it is on the backdrop of mismanagement of those, I believe, who had the responsibility to ensure that Barbados had an effective transport system. And it clearly, for me, shows that there was a lack of understanding of how important transportation is within a society. Because if you understood how important transportation is, the mismanagement that we saw within the Transport Board would have never occurred. Sir, and people are saying it's due to things like corruption and bribery. And that corruption and bribery, Mr. Deputy President, is now coming at a cost that the taxpayers and commuters now have to pay. Sir, and it is not only just taxpayers and commuters, it is a certain class of Barbadian. The poor ones in our societies are the ones who have to now pay the price for those who encouraged the wastage that happened at the Transport Board. But sir, I don't like to harp on what went wrong, but I try to look at solutions. Sir, it has to be a holistic solution for the transport system in Barbados. One thing I think we can probably do, I don't know if it's possible, but in delivering better service, because we're now asking people to pay more, one of the things I think we could possibly do is have accurate information on bus arrivals and bus departures. Something as simple as that. Something as simple, I heard it's coming, I'll hold you to that. Something as simple as that, Mr. Deputy President, I think will alleviate some of the frustration that a lot of commuters have as it relates to the Transport Board and the running of buses. Sir, you may have a schedule, but you have to give the commuters the information. You travel all over the world. When we travel, you know when the buses come in, what type of bus may be coming, the information is there. So what we have to do now is look at how do we update the system that we give commuters the information on dashboards Is it going to be on an app that they can download? And even on the bus itself, when you ride on a train in London or New York or whatever the case is, you have the dashboard actually in the train. And you're aware of what is the next stop, if there are any delays going on. And that allows you to plan better what is happening. When you leave home at 6 o'clock, and for instance, you have to get work for 8 o'clock, you say, okay, 2 hours. Can't take 2 hours to get anywhere in Barbados. But you stand at a bus stop for an hour and a half and you have no idea when a bus is coming. You cannot plan then to make alternative decisions. So information, I think, is key in one of the solutions in terms of bus arrivals and departures and where the bus is at any given time using technology, sir. Sir, I think also allowances for families who have more than 2 children under the age of 16. That should be something that should be considered. I know school children at this point, they ride free when they're in school clothes. But sir, what about the things like summer vacation, Easter vacation? If you are a mother, you have 3 kids going into town to collect medication, whatever the case may be, and you don't want to leave your children at home, that is an enormous burden that is going to be placed on parents who have, I'm not saying it's not going to be an enormous burden for others, but I'm saying if you have children under the age of 16, that is going to be an enormous burden to bear for larger families, Mr. Deputy President. Sir, and I say in terms of my final point on this, in terms of solutions, is that we need to modernize the transport sector and the transport service. And Senator Holder, she spoke about alternative facts as it relates to our friend and leader in the North. She used the term alternative facts. But sir, I want to use another term this morning that the leader from him, that the leader in the North, usually in his coming on to his campaign, the end of his campaign. And sir, as it relates to the transport service, I say drain the swamp. Drain the swamp. Reissue the licenses based on travel patterns, population density, and give quotas. Stop playing politics. Reissue the license. Why can it be that hard? You see a system that is failing, constantly failing. And it frustrates younger persons like me, and I don't want to get too wrapped up in it, but it frustrates persons like me in Barbados, where you see clearly what the solutions are. They're written on the wall. But for some reason, someone in some back room keeps making an excuse to keep the system the way it is. And now what we have, sir, and I'm trying not to get too emotional about it, you have a system where you're dragging an entire transport system down to prop up a few people. My mother works in St. Philip. We live in St. James. There's some nights my mother's at the bus stop for 2 hours. And then I have to say to her, don't worry, Mom, I'll come up for you. Because persons need to be propped up. You cannot hold people hostage, Mr. Deputy President. For a transport system, no, you're putting people's safety at risk. Standing up by bus stop at 9 o'clock at night, no proper lighting. Reissue the license based on technical solutions. But it will take people of good conscience and of good character to introduce measures like those. And I move on from that point, Mr. Deputy. What I think, though, is that government needs to also look at the role it wants to play in the transport sector and ask itself, are we going to remain in the sector? And if we're remaining in the sector, what does that look like? Or is it pulling out of the sector and being a completely privatized system, and it becomes a strong regulator? I think that is also the type of conversation that we have to have regarding the transport industry. And also looking at measures that propel the use of renewable energy vehicles and things like electric bikes. And persons may say, that sounds fanciful and whatnot. But if I had the opportunity to talk to somebody who was around in the 1920s, and you tell them that we have the number of cars that we have on the road now, they'd laugh at you, Mr. Deputy President. They'd laugh, because they said, no way, that's not possible. But sir, moving on, another measure that I want to talk about that hasn't really been ventilated because it mainly isn't a hot topic. It isn't, excuse me if I can use this word, Mr. President, it's not a sexy policy. It isn't a hot topic or a sexy measure. But this issue of paternity leave, the issue of now introducing paternity leave, and I think that is something that, or a way or a direction that we really need to start going in. Because people talk about, sustainable development and inclusive societies, but you actually have to start putting policies in place that change the way the society looks and how it interacts with each other. And sometimes people get a little confused, or they see sustainability as only environmental sustainability. But there's also social issues that need to be addressed. And I think this measure of paternity leave, when it does come on stream, is something to be lauded. Because we have to create a society that is more caring and is more sensitive. So the issues that we're having in our homes clearly is an indication that we have to have better parenting. I tell persons all the time, if you see somebody in trouble, if you see certain behaviors from them, sit down, have a conversation, and ask them, what is your relationship like with your parents? Don't ask them about their friends, don't ask them about school. Ask them about their parents. And you will get so much more information and so much more clarity as to why there's deviant behavior or something going wrong in a person's life. And this issue, sir, of paternity leave is one that is progressive. In my opinion, I believe it is progressive. Sir, in countries such as Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, and these countries have GDP per capita that are substantial. I can't remember the exact statistics, but I did look them up. I can't remember them. They offer paternity leave. And in some instances, fathers get full paid leave, or up to 80%. 80% of their salaries went on paternity leave. So, sir, as I say, it is a step for me in the right direction. Sir, overall, the estimates provide us with a blueprint, almost, of how government intends to attain the primary surplus of 6%. And I'm sure that there will be some fluctuations in how we reach that 6% in the upcoming year because of the policy measures directly related particularly to income tax and corporation tax. Because current revenue is set for $3.1 billion. And sir, tax on income from profits is expected to be $929 million, and VAT is expected to come in at $948 million. Current revenue, as I said, Mr. President, is $3.1 billion. When you add the income and profits and VAT, you get a total of $1.8 billion. Those two categories alone, $1.8 billion out of the $3.1 billion that you're trying to attain is coming from income and profits and VAT. So that's 60% of our expected current revenue. So I presume with the fluctuations in or volatility that we've seen in income tax, corporation tax, and VAT, that a close eye will be kept on those categories of taxes because they represent 60% of current revenues. In that vein, it means that any shortfalls that occur along the way in any of those measures means they have to be looked at or found in another tax or reduced expenditures. And so that is the difficulty I believe some people have with focusing mainly on fiscal policy for achieving the 6% primary surplus, or rather how we cope with the economic problems that we have. Because fiscal policy is only one category of policy instrument that you can use. Sir, some persons have said that we need to probably look at trade policy and enacting some of the measures or instruments that we have at our disposal to somewhat curtail, for a temporary time, to somewhat curtail the importation of certain goods and services to kickstart the local manufacturing sector and local production. Sir, some have even said that we possibly need to look at our fixed exchange rate. And that is a taboo subject, and there's a lot of fear around the value of the Barbados dollar. And I wonder if it is a fear just because it is a fear, because no one has ever really explained to Barbadians what are the other options. Sir, there's the option of changing our monetary policy so that our dollar is now guided by a managed floating exchange rate. Sorry, I'm going to wrap up. I'm always brief, sir. You have a managed exchange rate, and that is to reflect your trade. The value of your dollar is now attached to various currencies, and it's managed in a way that it can float within a policy band for flexibility. So it's not that you go and you devalue the dollar. It is that for trade purposes, you are now, the value of your dollar is now more reflective of the persons that you do business with outside of Barbados. And sir, even in reflection of it, I think sometimes what has made us stable has also made us stuck. Because we've relied on the fixed exchange rate, as Senator Adams said, it's almost like a disciplinary rod, I believe it was, for policy, a training rod. Because we've relied on it and we've not gone out. Growth happens and innovation happens outside of your comfort zone. I'm not saying to be reckless with monetary policy, but I think the options of other things in which can take us forward, can leapfrog us into growth, should be at least explored. Sir, as I wrap up, I want to bring us to the cases of Grenada and Jamaica. And I always like to look at examples where you can learn lessons. And sometimes you don't have to be burned by the fire to see the burn to know that you don't touch the fire. Sir, Grenada and Jamaica are the most recent ones who have gone through IMF agreements. Grenada had their extended credit facility for 3 years, and Jamaica is now coming on to the end of their standby arrangement. Sir, in the case of Grenada, let me start with Grenada. They had, as I said, a 3-year extended credit facility. And sir, they did a debt restructuring as well. And the difference between their debt restructuring, one glaring difference, is that they did not restructure their T-bills. Grenada did not restructure their T-bills, their treasury bills. That was excluded from the debt restructuring. And what I also found was that Grenada did not default on their debt during the debt restructuring, but they announced a comprehensive and collaborative debt restructuring. Sir, and on that note, all I will say here is sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it. They had a comprehensive and collaborative debt restructuring. So another dimension of the IMF program that Grenada was under is they had a measure called the Citizenship Program Revenue Sharing Clause in their debt restructuring. That is where they issued the new bonds for 2030, and a portion of those bonds was given in eligible revenues to shareholders through their Citizen by Investment program. So they not only restructured, but they gave bondholders an extra piece of the pie from the Citizenship by Investment program. Sir, they also factored in spending on a lot of social services. They targeted spending in social services. Things like education, housing, health, entrepreneurship. And then on top of that, targeted social spending for those in lower income brackets, they had a mandate for pro-poor strategies. Sir, Grenada came out of their IMF program in 2017. In 2018, their growth was 5.7%. And they're expected to lead the Caribbean in 2019 in economic growth. Grenada, I'm still on Grenada. But sir, I can move to Jamaica now because you told me I had 5 minutes, so I'm going to continue. Sir, and what I'll say about Jamaica is they are currently wrapping up a standby arrangement, but they were previously in an extended fund facility. As you would know, we've heard in here, Jamaica has had a long relationship with the IMF from the 1970s. But sir, what I found interesting when I went on the IMF's website, and I will read it directly, as it relates to their 5th review of their standby arrangement, it was concluded that the IMF team, listen carefully, Mr. Deputy President, the IMF team supports the reduction in the primary surplus target of 0.5% of GDP to 6.5% to facilitate higher spending in social assistance, citizen security, and rural infrastructure for the upcoming year. And the reduction in the primary surplus target should further boost growth and job creation. They support the reduction of the primary surplus target. So, sir, when people get concerned about a primary surplus of 6% for 4 years, it's because you understand that government's fiscal position is almost stranglehold. And with the lack of sectoral performance that we've been seeing, there's an urgency on some Barbadians to hear a comprehensive economic growth plan. And I'm not saying there isn't one, I'm saying there was justification for it, Mr. Deputy President. So these are the types of lessons I think that we have to look at. We haven't wrapped up our international credit debt restructuring as yet. And given Grenada's case, I think we need to look at more innovative ways on how we can woo our creditors into accepting the terms that we're asking them to accept. So, sir, what I say is yes, we have to endure. The road ahead is going to be hard, but sir, I really do hope that along the way we find the opportunities to empower average Barbadians. And I say to a lot of young adults like myself, we have to play our part. And sometimes that may mean making sacrifices. So if it is a case that you have to skip some of the expenses that you're accustomed making, stop spending your money on liabilities. Stop spending your money on liabilities. Look at how you can create wealth among yourselves. Look at group economics, Mr. Deputy President. Because, sir, that is how we will drive new business in Barbados, and that is how we're going to create a new social status for a lot of Barbadians. And, sir, a lot is at stake. Our future and the generations to come, their future is also at stake. And, sir, we cannot fail this test. Because as we've seen, the world will not give us handouts. The EU blacklisting recently of Barbados is that if that is not a clear indication to us that we have to earn our way in this 21st century world, and we have to wake up and we have to empower ourselves. And so I close with that message of we have to endure, but I hope that along the way we have different conversations that empower a lot of Barbadians as well, because sometimes it's adversity that brings out the best in persons. Mr. Deputy President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you for your frank analysis of the budget, Senator Drakes. I see the President. Yeah.
Happy to recognize Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise on this occasion, excuse me, to, of course, lend my support to the the appropriation bill, which is before us, which considers the estimates of expenditure for financial year 2019 to 2020, which we saw laid recently in the other place. And I wish in my comments, Mr. President, to connect these estimates of expenditure with the subsequent presentation of the budget statement by the Prime Minister of Barbados. Mr. President, I wish to begin my comments by quoting from one of my fellow senators, not one of my colleague senators on the government side, but an opposition senator from on the other side. In our debate, Mr. President, held earlier this week, I believe it was on Tuesday, Senator Drakes in her presentation, not on the matter of the estimates, but on the matter of this ban against single-use plastics. She, who is passionate about all things environmental, Mr. President, made what I consider to be the statement of the season. She made a statement that again, and today, with her presentation on the estimates, reaffirmed in my mind that she indeed sits on the wrong side of the table, because her comments are certainly not ad idem with her colleagues on the other side. She said, in support of the ban on single-use plastics, and I want to quote, she said, "We cannot continue kicking the can down the road." She said, "We need as a people to stop coming up with excuses and to deal with the issues before us. And these issues," she said, "are grounded in environmental sustainability." Mr. President, if you listen to the in-chamber opposition and the outside chamber atmospheric noises, you would believe that they are actually in favor, oftentimes, not you, Senator Drakes, of course, of kicking selected cans down the road. Unless, Mr. President, it is their favorite pet issue. When it is their favorite pet issue, it is urgent, it is important, lots of analytical thought goes into it, and it must be treated to with immediacy and with urgency. But for all other things, Mr. Deputy President, if you listen to them carefully, you are of the view that we should continue kicking the can down the table. And I say that, Mr. President, because every week, week after week, as we stand here, we hear conversations about how rushed everything is and how quickly everything is being done. But Mr. President, if you follow their mantra, aside from the fact that we understand that there are those that love to hear the sound of their own voice, but better yet when it is followed by a scintillating headline in the news, we would not be a country delayed by 10 years, but by 20 or even 30, Mr. President. The rest of the world, Mr. President, I am fully persuaded, and I believe that that is the view of this administration, is not parked waiting for us to play catch-up. As a small, open economy, we are already, at all times and in all things, always playing catch-up. And after the travesty of the last 10 years, we are set not just 10 years behind the curve, but we are set 30 years at best behind what should be our development trajectory in 2019. And so if we were not moving, in the words of a senator from another country at another time, to reclaim our time, we would find ourselves not just with a lost decade, but with a lost generation. We are at a time, Mr. President, where we have to move beyond playing these pointless political games of one-upmanship and popularity contests that people may enjoy in the beginning. But, Mr. President, they come to detest them in the long run. And if you doubt me, ask the Democratic Labour Party today. We are in a moment of time where these estimates represent not just a financial year before us, but 10 years of estimates and budget statements, and perhaps, Mr. President, we can comfortably acknowledge even more than that. That makes these estimates a watershed moment for us in this time. We're dealing with an estimates bill for a period in time in our history that seeks to unravel not just the symptoms of the problem, but the problem itself. We have a fiscal problem, but Mr. President, we also have a structural problem. And I want to take a moment in this setting to acknowledge the important changes that have been made to the estimates format. And I want to bring, before I get into my substantive comments, some clarity to this debate. From experience, Mr. President, I know that there are many Barbadians who are now for the first time engaging in what is the governance process and the discussion on the governance process. Estimates of expenditure are conducted ministry by ministry, entity by entity, statutory organization by statutory organization under the leadership of the Ministry of Finance. So you typically have the Ministry of Finance meeting in segregated sessions with each ministry at a time. They meet also with private sector stakeholders and all of the various sectoral groups, and the estimates are prepared individually. And then those things are accumulated, brought through the Ministry of Finance, and then thereafter, after extensive elaboration back and forth, they are agreed to by Cabinet. But Mr. President, the new estimates format has allowed Barbadians to have a conversation that is not just a small conversation. It has allowed Barbadians to understand the context of government and governance. It has helped Barbadians to understand where money comes from, where it goes to, why it is allocated and why it is not allocated. And one thing I want to say to the public of Barbados in this moment is to challenge the often repeated statement that we are, as a government, talking amongst ourselves. Mr. President, I am not certain what the naysayers understand by the term election of representatives. But the process of election of representatives to the House of Assembly in this country means that constituents across this nation go to a polling station and represent persons who they wish to speak in this place on their behalf. Those persons engage with their constituents and they represent their ministries. And so when anyone standing in these spaces speaks on behalf of the people, they speak on behalf of the people and not to themselves. We have gotten into this notion that we are here in our own right. None of us is here, Mr. President, in our own right. We are here by virtue of a public engagement process that says, these are the policies that I support, these are the people that I trust to implement them, and we want you to represent them, and thereafter the others are appointed like those here in this place. Mr. President, so I wish to debunk the very idea that the nature of Parliament is an entity speaking to itself. We come with the full backing of the people of Barbados who brought us here. So when we speak, Mr. President, in the estimates format, that is what is behind us. But more importantly, the idea of the last 10 years, and I'll be very frank with you because this is personal to me, Mr. President. I know that we as a people are very upset about what has happened financially, what has happened reputationally, what has happened in terms of where we are developmentally. We are all concerned about those things. But for me, what is personal to me, Mr. President, is what I consider to be the dumbing down, the active attempt to dumb down our people in the last 10 years. You had an administration that told us this, that attempted to tell us that the sky was pink. And if we didn't believe it was pink, they would challenge that and say, what are you talking about? The sky is pink. I'm telling you it's pink. And they would want you to actually look up and tell you, yes, I believe you, it's pink. They said the most outrageous things, the most ludicrous things, and challenged you to tell them they were wrong. The estimates format, Mr. President, for the first time, started the process again in 10 years of elevating the conversation in this country. It brought people into the confidence of the government. It showed people how government is run. There were people who said to me, Mr. President, I never knew all those people worked in the ministry. I never understood that that is what happens. And so you had an engagement process that, Mr. President, above all else, sought to empower, sought to educate, and importantly, aside from the important process of transparency and engagement, it sought to elevate the quality of conversation, and that is a powerful thing, Mr. President. And so I want to take the time to celebrate those persons who represented the format of the estimates, those people who sat behind those who were in front, those who prepared the estimates. I happen to know that these are estimates, the estimates processes that took place on Saturdays, on Sundays, late into the night and midnight, bank holidays. These people worked tirelessly, and I want to celebrate the public servants of this country who put these documents together. Mr. President, because we are in this place, I also want to acknowledge the people who work in the Parliament buildings, because we have kept a blistering pace. We have been here week after week, looking at bill after bill, and despite the critique, Mr. President, the fact of the matter is that we could not be here had it not been for them. And I want to celebrate them, the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, who prepares all these bills and all these documents every time, and they are the ones who enable us to do the public's business. I want to celebrate them. This is what we call elevating the conversation. It's easy to get up and say all kinds of loose things. The first thing that comes to your head flies out through your mouth. But this, Mr. President, this estimates process has been a substantive step in re-engaging an educated public. Mr. President, if you listen to the people asserting that the government, just 10 months after taking office, should stop talking about the last 10 years, you would forget that government, as our Prime Minister said before, is about choices, the choices that you make. There can be no dithering now, Mr. President. Decisions and choices are being made to save our dollar, to contain the national debt. Decisions are being made to address social services by freeing up expenditure from other wasted areas. Decisions are being made to right-size our public service. And decisions ultimately are being made to ensure that, as is the case with environmental sustainability, an economically and financially sustainable Barbados is being created for future generations. What is before us now, Mr. President, is what can best be described as a war government. We are not in a war of shock and awe with bombs and tanks, but we are battling blacklists. We are fighting to preserve our currency and with it our way of life. We've overcome the first phase of the battle to restructure our domestic debt, but we are still moving to fight the battle on our external debt. We're fighting to keep our heads above water while the sludge of debt service ratios threatens to drag us down. We're fighting to provide monies for social services, but yet investing in growth initiatives. This is a war by any name, Mr. President, but one we are determined to win because we are a war government. Most of the indicators that Senator Drake talks about are those we inherited. The timelines for which she attempts to treat with them are those we inherited. It has been 10 months, and we are not responsible for growth trajectories that were flawed or going in the wrong direction in the last 4 years, 3 years, 2 years that we're now seeing the indicators of, but we are responsible for making sure that they go in the opposite direction, and we will do just that. And we will do it in a time, Mr. President, where there is austerity and structural adjustment, and so we will not be able to do it all at once. And I know that there are some, if you listen to them again, expect that in 10 months we magically have been able to replenish the treasury, and that we have magically been able to solve all the things it took 10 years and more to do. But we are staying the course, Mr. President. We are staying the course. We, Mr. President, are fighting for the sustainability of this nation we love. We know we all love this nation, Barbados. And I stand here to say to our people, the Barbadian people, that this government, this war government, is defending our people and our future with the measures and decisions that stabilize our fiscal position today, because it takes money to care, money to do. And we are charting an economic path for tomorrow and ensuring a future for all. None of this matters to many Barbadians, not if they're not seeing the impact of the decisions we make now on their lives and on their households, perhaps later. We understand that, and I will come back to this point on development being ultimately linked to households a little later. But what I can say at this stage is that for all that I have already said, let it be clear, we, the Barbados Labour Party administration, are not kicking this can down the table. Mr. President, this government is not insensitive to the impact of some of the difficult decisions that have had to be made. We understand that people feel both benefits and the challenges. That is understandable. So we have to explain without tiring why these are challenging times and what we hope to derive as the benefits. And I want to use an example to put it in context. Mr. President, one night, a friend of mine, a medical doctor, called me, very upset, but they just wanted to get something off their chest, and they were struggling. They called to deal with the painful reality at the time that sat on their shoulders where they were balancing life and death. One piece of critical life-saving equipment in the QEH was working. They had one patient already hooked up to this piece of equipment, and a second patient came in, and they would not have made it through the night unless they too had access to this equipment. The burden that they carried when they called, Mr. President, in the dead of the night, was heavy. It was painful. They did their job, and they did the best thing that they could to keep both patients alive. And while I can't say what the ultimate outcome of it was, Mr. President, what I can tell you is this, that in the midst of them calling me in their distress, they also simultaneously were dealing with the attacks from family members who had a single perspective. What was their single perspective? How do I preserve the life of my own loved one? And that is understandable. That's their responsibility to look after their own interests, and that's good. That's important. We all must look after our own. But a doctor in a public role, has a broader responsibility. That family, those families who were lambasting that doctor in the moment could not see, they did not see the other patient that he also had to manage. They did not see, they could not see, Mr. President, the pain of that second family. They also could not and did not see that the person standing in front of them on the receiving end of their wrath was battling their own crisis. In those circumstances, you would hear people on the outside blistering doctors. They don't care about people. They don't care about families. They're callous and they're wicked. But that's a story of people. That is a story of government and opposition politics, Mr. President. When you have no responsibility to anything or anyone, you can stand on the outside and criticize everything. It's easy when you don't have to be the one to balance ensuring that the Queen Elizabeth Hospital has sutures and syringes to treat basic needs, far less life-saving equipment, with ensuring that books are on the shelves of our schools, teachers are in classrooms, and toilets on seats on toilets in bathrooms. When you don't have to be the one to make these kinds of choices, you can sit on the outside and hypothesize in grand terms about all the government has to do is, because the choice is not yours. When you don't have to worry how the public is going to access buses in a timely manner, in good condition, on a continuous basis, and still keep the cost manageable, and still balance that against the needs of schools, hospitals, polyclinics, domestic sectoral development, external representation, investment in growth, you can afford to sit on the outside and shout from hollow mountaintops about a government who doesn't care about people. You have that luxury, Mr. President. When you don't have to ensure that Barbadians in all classes, lower, middle, and high income, who share one thing in common, because we are not a divisive people, all one thing in common, we are all Barbadians, are able to achieve their legitimate ambitions, you can afford to make loud noises about what we don't care about. But those things have no relevance to governance, especially in a war government where we have very few resources to go along. But there must come a time, Mr. President, where you stop prioritizing partisan, political affiliation, or personal likes or dislikes over and above the national interests. They will never stop shouting, but we must never stop working. We as an administration have shared with the people of this nation what we are about. We will not tire of telling people what is happening and why. We will tell people what we face, but more importantly, we will tell people our solutions to fixing them. We will show people how we are planning for a future and how we intend to mitigate challenges. We will help our people to dream and to aspire again. We will never again allow mediocrity to be exalted as excellent. We will not have the small conversations, and we will move past this notion of dumbing down our people. In the last decade, Mr. President, we were bombarded by talk about the global recession, and I want to talk for a moment about that. If the economy retracted, Mr. President, it was the global recession. If tourism numbers fell, Mr. President, it was the global recession. If the rain fell, there was a global recession. From every report and every international agency, the global recession lasted from 2007 to 2008. We heard about this global recession attracting Barbados up to 2018. What was the issue in 2009, 2010, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013? What was the issue then? But I want to start in 2008, Mr. President. You know why I'm going to start in 2008? Because in 2008, the U.S. financial crisis began with the mortgage crisis, and then it mushroomed into a banking crisis. In 2008, we went into an election in 2008. And what should have come before the people of Barbados in 2008 with looming external circumstances in a small open economy was a war budget, was a war manifesto, and was war estimates. Instead, what came to the people of Barbados was a manifesto of giveaways which promised popularity, which guaranteed popularity, soared social spending, and put our economy on an unstable footing and unable to respond to external crises. We created a domestic financial crisis in response to the external financial one. The external financial crisis was not what bothered us. And I remember, Mr. President, when, in attempting to elevate the conversation, One university professor called Professor Dr. Brian Francis delivered a lecture at the Barbados Chamber of Commerce. He was the first non-partisan voice to sound the alarm, and he said, Barbados does not have an economic problem, we have a fiscal problem. And they took to these halls and dragged this man all across the floor. They did not listen. And with all that they did, they made the situation worse. In 2008, they talked about lowering the cost of living, and I want to get into some figures. But let's go back first, in order to do that, to the estimates debate of that year. Revenue was projected to increase at that time by 10.4%. But expenditure soared by 20.5%. Capital expenditure increased by 3.3%. We had a deficit in that year of $241 million. But of that, we then had a total debt financing level of $737 million. By 2009, the debt gap was widening. Our debt was increasing and our fiscal position was worsening. Brian Francis was absolutely right when he said we had a fiscal problem. But at the time, with no investment in development initiatives, no investment in diversification, none of the sectoral development that Senator Drake spoke about, they caused our domestic situation to become worse. And there was an inadequate response to external circumstances. Instead of taking corrective measures at any point since 2008, they continued, Mr. President, to kick the can down the road. They said they were going to focus on improving access to property ownership. Instead, what did we see? Poorly conceived and poorly subscribed projects like Coverley. We saw the Grotto project that was more heavily laden with steel than with concrete. It was not about providing housing, when they should have been developing new sectors and diversification of existing industries. They misunderstood the idea of diversification, and they proceeded then to create, for the first time in our history, a domestic steel industry. As chairman of the Bridgetown Port, Mr. President, I am amazed that with all the investment they made in the steel industry, Mr. President, that I have never seen a single container leaving this country for export to new markets. Never. It has not generated a single cent in foreign exchange. They talked about healthcare for all, yet primary healthcare institutions and the sole tertiary one was allowed to languish with a yearly shortfall of approximately 50 million. So what does a government like the Barbados Labour Party administration do with a country facing these issues in 10 months? We introduced a healthcare levy. This is sending approximately $4 million in additional funding to the QEH. Every single polyclinic is seeing increases in their allocations, and I want to go through them for the benefit of the public. Winston Scott went from $4 million to $10 million. Eunice Gibson has gone from 1.7 million to 3.8 million. Maurice Bayer went from 2.4 to 6.1 million. St. Philip Polyclinic, 1.6 million to 4.0 million. Brantford Tate Polyclinic from 2.079 to 4.9 million. Glebe in St. George had the most modest increase, but it was an increase nonetheless, and they went from 1.2 to 1.7 million. This is a government that was able to do in 10 months, and in these estimates, with an empty treasury and burgeoning debt for the health sector, what the previous administration was unable to do in 10 years. There was no single allocation, Mr. President, between 2008, and I've gone through the estimates, between 2008, every single year I have gone through the estimates, Mr. President, until this year, where the allocation for health care was higher than it is today in 2019, under these conditions, Mr. President, under this administration. Then, Mr. President, they talked about education for the 21st century, but I want to start with their first line of their manifesto of 2013. It said the following, and I'm quoting, "The Democratic Labour Party recommits Barbados to high-quality free education for all, from preschool to tertiary level." Yet, in his budget of 2013-2014, in August of that same year, right after winning the election, they could not say promise made, promise kept. They turned around and announced that effective 2014, Barbadian students would have to pay their way for tertiary education. We're talking about a minimum for each Barbadian, a minimum. And this is for the Faculty of Humanities, but if you aspire to be a medical doctor or anything, it's even more. $5,625 per semester we're talking about here. And the effect of that, Mr. President, on the university was $42 million in lost transfers. And we made it worse, Mr. President, by not paying our bills at all. Mr. President, this was the administration that told us families first, but they didn't spend any money on families and community development. They thought that the extent of housing was cookie-cutter houses. The extent of education was poor Barbadians having to go and beg a minister for a scholarship to pay your way so you could be dependent on them. Or their vision of lowering the cost of living and investing in families was you having to suffer the indignity of taking your light bill, your water bill, your telephone bill, and going to their constituency office for them to pay it. But God forbid, Mr. President, if you were looking for a job. If it was for your son or for your nephew, you may get a pass, but if it was your daughter, it was work for work. That was their notion of community development, Mr. President. Mr. President, they sought to create a culture of mendicancy where our people were no longer craftsmen of our fate, but we were dependent on them if you could not pay your own way as benefactors. This is not the Labour Party way, Mr. President. We are invested in people. It is for that reason, Mr. President, why some of the things that we've already spoken about, and Senator Springer has already spoken extensively about education, we understand that the government of Barbados effectively then, by June of 2018, announced that we would be immediately reinstating payment for Barbadians attending the University of the West Indies. Mr. President, we heard about a new economic policy paradigm. All of the people now talking about no growth. They were the architects of this new economic policy paradigm. But let's start with the who of the so-called policy paradigm. For close to 9 years, we had the appointed CEO of the local steel industry presiding over the excavation of the Treasury and the removal of even the ground fill, Mr. President. Then they turned around and filled all their senior posts with the party faithful, whose only qualification was the ability to keep their mouths shut. They were paid for delivering nothing. These are the same people who are now behind the loud shouts that this administration has shut down the steel industry, put the locks back on the Treasury, and ensured that we have qualified people managing our affairs. Let me tell you about who these qualified people are. These are the people who are objecting to Barbados identifying an allocation of resources for consultants. Who are these consultants, Mr. President? We're talking about senior fellows of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the former head of currency and commodity research for JP Morgan, member of the OECD Emerging Market Network, a member of the French Presidential Commission on the Global Credit Crunch, and visiting scholars to the IMF and the European Central Bank. These are the people who we have brought home. But what is most important, Mr. President? These are Barbadians. These are Barbadians. People who can't advise themselves, far as a single person or entity, have suddenly decided that these people should not, in our time of need, not in our time of plenty, in our time of need, these people should not work for this country. It is because of these skills, Mr. President, these persons, that this administration can say that we have successfully concluded the domestic debt restructuring. It is because of their skills that we have been able to begin the process of right-sizing our ministries. It is not about the current economic team, Mr. President, that the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean said the following, and I'm quoting here. For a number of years, the Central Bank of Barbados has helped to finance the fiscal deficit by purchasing government debt and creating money. They went on to say, not about us, but about them, that these actions put pressure on the currency peg. It was not about our economic team that the report further went on to say that by 2017, the central bank's contribution to the fiscal deficit had increased by 91.9%. We, in contrast, with the new economic team, have managed to slash the debt to GDP ratio from 170% to 124%. And we are pushing to bring it down to 100% and ultimately where it should stay by 2025 at 60%. You've heard this from the Prime Minister. We've also at the same time saved $1.3 billion because of these skills in interest payment. This is the Labour Party way. In 10 months, Mr. President, we made the decisions that others did not have the intestinal fortitude to make, and they kicked the can down the road for the last 10 years. But we are in the process, Mr. President, of turning things around. But, Mr. President, they began to scrape the bottom. They began to sell assets for ridiculous prices. They wanted money. The Hilton, Barbados National Terminal Oil Company, we have pulled those deals back. They started to push forward with the most egregious of contracts to get the smallest amount of money for assets and aspects of our patrimony that in reality were worth far more. The Bridgetown Port, I'm going to come back to that. The Barbados Water Authority, the Sanitation Service Authority. We, Mr. President, are turning those things around in 10 months. We did not put plasters on gangrene, Mr. President. We are fixing the festering sores underneath, and in so doing, we accept that there are some tender spots. We accept that there are those that are the most vulnerable. And it is because we accept that, Mr. President, that we can hold up the continued provision of free bus fares to school children, the elderly, and our armed forces. Because we accept those sore spots, we also have to accept that the poor are not only those persons catching buses as commuters. We have continued to subsidize the Transport Board for the cost of bus fares because we believe, yes, that we have a structural problem, yes, we have a transport sector problem, yes, we have a Transport Board problem, but we also have to ensure that we provide for those who need more, who need us more. And so we continue to subsidize the cost of bus fare, the difference between the $5.40 that was recommended and the $3.40 that we have introduced. But, Mr. President, we must not forget that the poor are not just those riding the buses. The people who drive buses as conductors and as drivers. These are people who have families to support as well. The poor are those persons who have also struggled to pay rising fuel costs for the last 10 years. There are also the people who may have a single public service vehicle in an environment where maintenance costs were soaring because roads remain unfixed for years, Mr. President. They are the poor too. The poor also includes the drivers who have families that are not any different than ours and who work for entities at the Transport Board and in the private system who on any given month struggle to pay their bills. They are the poor too. And so the government of Barbados, because we are not on the outside making loud, vacuous noises, have to find the balance between providing for commuters and those who are on the other side of the fence who are also poor, Mr. President. The poor exist on multiple levels, and any responsible government must ensure that we can protect them all as much as is possible. We want a service that is better than we have now. We deserve that. But we have to start thinking, Mr. President, about what it costs to provide that service. What does it cost to provide new buses? What does it cost to maintain them? What does it cost to pay drivers to drive them? What does it cost to fuel them? We have to provide a service to our people, and we cannot disconnect the cost of providing a service from the cost of paying for that service, Mr. President. But this is a caring government, and so we subsidize the cost of every bus fare for that reason, even though we are still carrying the cost in an empty treasury. Mr. President, I want to move on to the notion of poor people for a moment. I want to talk about poor people that the government is being accused of not looking out for. Mr. President, income tax no longer exists for the lower income earners. Below 35,000 people don't pay income tax. The distortionary tax that was an SRL was removed by this administration. The budget to the Welfare Department, if you go through these estimates, has been increased by 25%, Mr. President. The National Assistance Board has seen an increase in the estimates over 2017 to 2018 to $9.1 million, and it is projected to be further increased in 2020 to 2021 by $11.3 million. This is a government that cares about poor people, Mr. President, because even amongst of the little we have, we are making provision for those who are at the bottom of the income ladder. But let us be clear, Mr. President. There are those who think that investing in the poor or providing for the poor means keeping them in jobs that companies and ministries don't need. They don't realize that in the same way they need to feel fulfilled in their jobs and in their provision of services, that everyone else needs to feel that fulfillment too. They don't make the connection between overstaffed ministries and overstaffed companies and a bankrupt government, Mr. President, and then the retrenchments that they will complain about. So if this is a government that has committed to education sector reform, the equivalent of academic and TVET education, and is launching a First Jobs program, poor people need opportunities, not only handouts. Poor people need to be enabled to dream and not have to depend on anyone else to determine what their future looks like. By investing heavily, Mr. President, in education, we are investing in poor people. By committing to subsidize the economic cost of public transformation, Mr. President, this government is investing in poor people. By ensuring that our polyclinics are working again, this government is investing in poor people. That is who we are. We are committing to ensuring that we lift people out of poverty. And if people have their way, they will keep them in poverty and keep them dependent on the state. That is not the Barbados Labour Party way, Mr. President. If we're talking about transportation, and I'm only going to spend a few moments on that, we have to talk about roads. In this budget, we have 13 roads funded by the Latin American Development Bank, 10 roads funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, a bridge improvement program, 3 new lifts for the vehicle examination sector for the MTW, section of the MTW, investment in flood mitigation through the planned installation of new pump systems at Princess Alice and in the Bayland. There are also allocations for clearance of our gullies, particularly, Mr. President, in the rainy season. Over $10 million has been allocated for the maintenance of equipment. These are things which have a direct impact, Mr. President, on productivity and on customer service delivery. When we go into some MTW or any of these entities and we have to wait 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours because a piece of equipment is simply not working, Mr. President, we understand the value of a $10 million allocation for maintenance of equipment. And so I want to talk for a moment, though, Mr. President, about the non-statutory expenditure that is not included in these estimates, but which falls beneath a ministry that is provided for in this ministry. I want to talk about the Barbados Port. The port is a state-owned commercial enterprise, and we passed the Public Financial Management Act a few weeks ago in here, and you'll see it in Schedule 3. Just yesterday, Mr. President, the Bridgetown Port launched a process flows improvement project. We're very appreciative to the Caribbean Development Bank and our other partners who are working with us to get that done. And what does that mean for us, Mr. President? 90% of all the goods consumed in this country are imported. 90%. And 100%, Mr. President, of those goods arrive on these shores through the Bridgetown Port. What that means is that there is a direct correlation between the competitiveness of the ministries responsible for economic development and for commerce and for business support organizations like the Small Business Association, the Chamber of Commerce, and so on, and the Bridgetown Port's operations. There is a direct correlation between the performance of Customs and Excise Department and their ability to collect taxes and duties and things like port health and so on. What are we doing to ensure that we are able to meet our statutory obligations as entities while providing the best and highest quality service? That's what the Process Flows Improvement Project is about, and we kicked that off yesterday. We in the port are investing in the transformation of how Barbados does business and how we enable what we call the throughput to the wholesale, the distributive, and the retail sectors in this country. But we're not stopping there, Mr. President. We are looking to help reposition the nation and our economic development, our productive sectors. We're moving to reposition Barbados as a southern logistics hub for trade. We are moving aggressively into logistics and transshipment. Improving our logistics, Mr. President, is at the heart of economic growth and the competitiveness agenda for many countries. Trade powerhouses like Europe, the Netherlands, or in developing countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, and right here in the Caribbean, Cuba and Jamaica have done extraordinarily well in developing logistics hubs. And Jamaica has served successfully and developed a model for a northern logistics hub. And the work that we are doing in the Bridgetown port now will position Barbados to be the southern hub for the Caribbean in logistics. Through these initiatives, Mr. President, we will develop new jobs and new skills. I am pleased also to say that the Commonwealth Secretariat has responded favorably to our request to develop a port supply logistics chain for the Bridgetown port. Every single process, every single operation, every single service that we provide will now be mapped by the Commonwealth Secretariat. And how is that important to us, Mr. President? Over the top of that mapping will be, for the first time, the new skills that are needed to develop new sectors and new industries, and with it, new training opportunities, Mr. President. And I'll give you an example. We have a fleet of approximately 1,500 fishing boats and other leisure craft that function around Barbados. 100% of those boats, Mr. President, go offshore for repair annually. We do not have the capacity to do that at home. Yet we are struggling with persons not having a skill or not having a job, Mr. President. We in the Bridgetown port, under this government, are now going to be using the supply logistics chain for all of the services in the port, mapping what we do, what we're missing, what needs to be done, training up those persons in those new skills, and creating new jobs for Barbadians, Mr. President. That is very much a part of our agenda. Mr. President, we have just, in the last 4 weeks, launched a new vision. And I'm sorry that Senator Drakes is not in her seat, because I put this in expressly for her, Mr. President. We have a new vision for the Bridgetown port. And the Bridgetown port has now decided, amongst all of our team, we brought in some advisors to help us on this. We have set ourselves a new target, Mr. President. We will be the most innovative green maritime hub in the world by 2030. What does that mean, Mr. President? It means that you would have seen 2 weeks ago a request for proposals in the public newspaper for the introduction of solar panels. We spend $3 million annually on energy costs. We are looking to bring that down in the first instance by at least 30% and moving to increase that each year. We currently handle 100,000 TEUs, that's 20-foot equivalent containers. We're looking to push that to 180,000. We have about, in terms of cruise, 800,000 passengers every year. By 2030, we're looking to move that to 2 million passengers. 100% green energy is our ambition, and we are looking to also have 2 breakthrough research and development products also by 2021. We want to move on the port index. We are currently ranked at 126, and we are incrementally going to be moving that up so we become a best-in-class port. Mr. President, this is a government that is working. This is a government that is making transformational decisions. We are using entrepreneurial principles, Mr. President, to transform the way in which we in the port do business. And we are, of course, right-sizing a number of problematic contracts signed on the eve of an election that have created no end of exposure to liability that we are now navigating, Mr. President. Monies that we could be spending on developing the port, monies that we could be spending on transformation and training, we're now spending in attorney fees to try to get Barbados out of contracts that would put us in peril, Mr. President. But we are staying the course, Mr. President. We are staying the course. In a few weeks, we will be taking a delegation to meet with the ship owners that ply this Caribbean region. We're very grateful to partners like Tropical Shipping and others who are engaging with us and with whom we will be meeting at the level of their owners so that we can give effect to our ambition of becoming that southern logistics hub. And we're looking specifically at moving away from just imports and exports, but also expanding our transshipment business. Government of Barbados has also made a decision to separate cruise from cargo. And we are moving ahead with the decision to have a new cruise facility in the Bridgetown area. But Mr. President, I wish to also advise that you will see on this weekend a new request for proposals for a second cruise facility on the west coast of Barbados along Speightstown. So you will be looking to see a new transshipment space in the Bridgetown area, a new cruise facility in the Bridgetown area, and a second facility in Speightstown, expanding the reach of the Bridgetown port. This is not a sprint, Mr. President. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And we aren't trying to undo years of structural and policy-making damage in 10 months. We are working through making the changes, talking our people through those changes, and then building a new Barbados. Finally, Mr. President, I want to talk about the vision for growth. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, we saw a shift. And that shift helps to explain what we in this administration are doing here. There are many who are comfortable with the traditional orthodoxy of growth as driven by sectors, investment flows, and measured by GDP ratios. But in a paper titled A New Way to Measure Economic Growth and Progress, produced by the World Economic Forum, they said this: there has been the implicit assumption behind the standard growth model of recent decades, a rising tide of GDP, promoted particularly by supply-side reforms and increased incentives for private capital investment and export-oriented production that will ultimately lift all boats. But recent political developments around the world suggest that in most countries, most citizens lack confidence in this. And ever since the financial crisis, political leaders have been voicing similar skepticism, calling repeatedly in various communiques at the UN and the G20 for more deliberate and new efforts to make economic growth more socially inclusive. It went on to say this: since what gets measured gets managed, the primacy of GDP statistics tends to reinforce the imbalance of attention and resources applied to macroeconomic and financial stability policies, which influence the overall level of economic activity relative to the strength and equity of institutions and policy incentives in such structural policy areas as skills development, labor markets, competition, investor and corporate governance, social protection, and so on. Mr. President, what matters is this statement. This is surely part of the reason the consensus on inclusive growth has yet to progress from collected aspiration to collected action. But there must be a change in the standard model that underpins the mindset of most economic policymakers and the priorities they set. And it is for that reason that for the first time at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, they launched something called the Inclusive Development Index. And the index is based on the notion that most citizens evaluate their country's economic progress not by the amount of goods or services produced in the economy, GDP, but by their household's standard of living. This is a multidimensional phenomenon that encompasses income, employment opportunity, economic security, and quality of life. Mr. President, that is what we are hearing from the people in their country as a measure of growth. We understand that. And that is why we have outlined all that we have that speaks to people empowerment. Economic transformation that is socially inclusive. It is disruptive at first, yes, Mr. President, because we are engaging in structural change. But it is ultimately beneficial to all in the end. By transforming the structure of our country's institutions and economy, we are creating a new platform for inclusive growth. By stamping out corruption, we save our people the expense we now face of having to find money that just vanished. And by talking people through every step of the way, we are making compromises to hear valid feedback and keeping our feet close to the ground. Mr. President, in closing, The opening words of our national anthem go like this. Mr. President, the opening words of our national anthem go like this. In plenty and in time of need, when this fair land was young, our brave forefathers sowed the seed from which our pride is sprung. We have had times of plenty, Mr. President, but these are times of need. Just like our forefathers, though, these times require bravery. We have a legacy set by our forefathers, and in this time, in this season of need, we are committed, each and every one of us, and I believe each and every one of us on all sides of this table. But certainly, I can speak for those of us on this side, to leading with bravery, leading with confidence, leading with pride that will again spring free. And it is from our labor and our collective sacrifice now that others will speak later of forefathers who will then be us, who braved the onslaught to help this proud nation to stand, to bind our hearts from coast to coast with the pride of nationhood. We will, staying the course, write our names on history's page with expectations great, and we will be guardians of our heritage and firm craftsmen of our fate. And with these words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Mr. President, I move that the chamber be suspended until 2:15.